Coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore podcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Laura. And this week we have a very special guest joining us, a personal lifelong friend, but more importantly, a professional in the mental health field, Louis Amendola. World Mental Health Day was October 10th, and we wanted to do an episode for a while diving into the mental health that we see on the show, specifically exploring some of the possible diagnoses for some of our characters, how we may see them managing personal challenges that tie into those diagnoses, and tools that may have helped them in their lives to allow for a stronger well-being. We've always been clear that Kate and I are not mental health professionals, so we're very excited and lucky to be joined today by someone who actually is, and certainly much more qualified to speak on this. So, Louis, if you can just start off by introducing yourself, talk about your educational background, how long you've been a licensed therapist, and just what your career entails.
My name is Lou Amendola. As you hear, Laura calls me Louis. It's because we've known each other our entire lives. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I'm licensed out of New Jersey. I went to 4 years of undergraduate school, 3 years graduate school, then an additional year in an internship, and then several years after that to gain hours working under another therapist before I became fully licensed to work independently. Do not have my doctorate. It will happen one day, but in New Jersey, you only need a master's level degree to be a licensed clinician. I am able to diagnose. I am able to give recommendations in psychopharmacology. However, I cannot write prescriptions, but I do have the ability to diagnose. I work with a variety of individuals from all age ranges, adolescents all the way up to seniors, mostly talk therapy. My approach is what we call person-centered. We're conducting talk therapy and having the individual do self-exploration to mainly focus on the positives in their life, working through any trauma that they may have.
Awesome. That's a very cool background to have, and I can see why maybe it lends itself to watching a show like this. So why don't you tell us a little bit, too, about your Gilmore Girls fandom?
I started watching the show when it first came out. I was 13 years old. My mom was watching it and sort of just stumbled upon it because she was watching it. I wanted to be able to watch something with her, and I remember it took me a little while to get into it, but then we became religious watchers. Like every week we made sure we saw the new episode, and I remember being very disappointed when the show came to a close. And then obviously a year in the life came, which we were all very excited about. And looking at it as I've gotten older, and especially getting into this line of work, into this field, I started to look at things differently. I've rewatched the show a few times on Netflix, and just seeing the dynamic between all the characters and so many of their quirks, you start to just look at things differently, and it's not just Lorelai needing her coffee, or Rory stepping out of Yale for that period of time. Like, you start to look at things that Lorelai may have ADHD, short for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Rory was having a mental, a breakdown at that point. She was feeling the burden of college, and she started to feel very overwhelmed, and you just start to look at things differently, and especially rewatching the series, you always pick up on different things that you never picked up the last time. I feel like you always get something else out of it.
Agreed. No matter how many times we've watched it, we always find something new. And this is why we started this whole podcast, because we just kept seeing things in the real world and being like, oh, that connects back to Gilmore Girls. And we wanted to talk about it and add layers of richness to our experience of the show through these more complex ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest thing to me with rewatching it, as an adult is, again, mental health aside, there's just so many things that when I watched it as a young teen that just go over your head. And then, rewatching it as an adult, it just takes on a whole different life.
Yeah. I didn't even watch it as a teen. I watched it for the first time at 26. So
Wow.
almost 10 years ago. So I feel like I come at it with a different angle even than you guys
Mhm.
do. So
Yeah.
So, first question I want to ask, just going off of what you said, Lou, because you are a professional within the mental health field, do you think there's an actual benefit to try to view these characters through the lens of understanding what they may have going on in terms of their own mental health and giving them these diagnoses? Or do you think it's oversimplifying the characters and it's actually more harmful to try and label them as such?
So I will be upfront that there's no way you could give anyone a formal diagnosis just from what you see on TV. Now, obviously, this is a scripted show, but even when dealing with reality TV, you don't know what that individual is truly like, what they're experiencing, unless you were to have a full sit down with them, do a full evaluation. So, it is difficult to put your finger on certain diagnoses and in the different mental health topics that arise. However, there's definitely a lot of symptoms for different disorders out there that to me are very clear within Gilmore Girls.
yeah, I think diagnosis in this context, quote
Mhm.
unquote, bunny fingers, bunny ears, acts as a bit of a shorthand. It's like
Mhm.
a recognizable cluster of behaviors that we might be able to look at and say, hey, I recognize that. Even for myself, I'm not formally diagnosed, but I've sort of self assessed and learned a lot about ADHD, and I'm pretty
Mhm.
sure I have it. So I see a lot of myself in Lorelai, and just sometimes like the inability to follow through with things and the planner system that doesn't quite come to fruition, missing your Resha Plebisham appointment. Those kind of things are very relatable to a lot of us. I think as we start to understand these things more and they start to enter the vernacular and we start to apply them to pop culture, maybe we start getting a mirror for ourselves in that way and start to feel seen.
Mhm. One of the things that I really liked, Laura had we were emailing back and forth, and Laura had written me some different things that, she wanted to discuss today. And one of the things that I really liked is she brought up back when Gilmore Girls first came out versus now, and how mental health would be incorporated into it, from today's standpoint, because it is so prevalent now. So many individuals are open about mental health. And I think it shows just in A Year in the Life, which was already 10 years ago, the fact that they had the therapy, within the episodes, and that they were going to see a therapist. So it shows that I think the creators even themselves know that there's a lot of mental health, within the show, and they wanted to address that. One of the funny things that I was thinking about is if the show were to come out, currently, I know one of the running jokes was always Emily always having a different housekeeper every time Lorelai went over. I could picture them having a different therapist from week to week. um, Emily would obviously hear something that she didn't want to hear, and the same could be said for Lorelai. I think she would hear something she didn't want to hear, and I think that that would end up being a little thing that they could put in there, the different therapist almost every episode.
You almost kind of see that in the revival with
Mm-hmm.
Emily bailing out on the therapy so
Yep.
quickly.
Yeah. But maybe let's start with Emily as the matriarch of the Gilmore women. What are you seeing in her within her personality from the start, but also with how she mothered Lorelai, just based off of the flashbacks that we got, what we know about their dynamic with each other and their relationship, and how maybe even some of what Emily had or has going on spilled over into Lorelai, how it affected Lorelai, and then we can start talking about what you're seeing with Lorelai.
Sure. Emily definitely has narcissistic traits. That's a given. She also has, what sort of comes hand in hand with, narcissism and having those traits. You have this whole world, this whole identity in your mind of what you want life to look like. You want it perfected and to be perfection. And we see that, especially in the flashbacks, with Lorelai, when Lorelai was, they're finding out she was pregnant and she was gaining weight, and they're trying to zip up the I believe it was for her debutante ball, the gown. Um, Emily had to have it fit, and it obviously, in Emily's world, it was the dressmaker's fault. She messed up the sizes, the measurements. So there was so much pressure that she put onto Lorelai as her only child to sort of fit into this mold, this cookie cutter mold that she had for their family. And that's what, I believe was the major rift, what triggered Lorelai to leave. Emily, all of her friendships are seem to be based all on status. The DAR, the one thing I loved about it is, with the year in the life, Emily's full circle moment was saying that it was all bullshit. And that's right there acknowledging that the friendships are all superficial in their world. There's really no true, bond. Whereas, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that's something we see Lorelai ends up having with moving to Stars Hollow, is that the friendships are not superficial. They're not based on status. They're not based on who has this much money, who drives this car. They're all based, on genuine emotion, genuine friendship. It's completely different than the world Emily lives in.
Completely.
Yeah. So as Lorelai eventually splits from her parents because of that rift that you mentioned, and then we see Lorelai start to raise Rory on her own as a single parent. Let's start talking about what you've seen in Lorelai from the get-go in terms of what you think she may have going on, and therefore how that kind of altered or affected how she parented Rory.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lorelai, definite ADHD. Without a doubt, I could tell you, just even though watching the show, she definitely has ADHD. There's something in there, just the different quirks with the coffee and not being able to stay focused and jumping to a variety of different topics. Very impulsive, lack of organization. You could see just her house, the clutter, and there's just stuff everywhere. But in her mind, she's organized. She has a place for everything in its place, but that's not what it's like to the outside world. And I think that Lorelai's disorganization is something that she needs to function. Whereas you look at Lorelai's house versus the Gilmore house, and everything was just so in order, so neat and organized, that she needed to break free of that. And when we go to Lorelai raising Rory, she wants Rory to experience the freedom that she did not get, growing up. She wants Rory to experience friendships that are based on, feeling and liking one another and caring about one another, not just going to debutante balls and DAR meetings and things like that. And what's interesting is you sort of see how history comes full circle, like the whole dynamic there, because you end up seeing that when Rory starts to know her grandparents and starts to see what their lifestyle is like, she starts to realize that that's something that she does click with. And we start off the series with her attending Chilton, which I would say 90%, if not more, of the students at Chilton all fall into richer than Emily category. They come from families with a lot of money and status. And Rory starts to realize that in order to excel, and get to where she wants to be in life, sometimes you do need the connections that come with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually waffled on Lorelai's ADHD initially. Now I'm firmly in the camp that, yeah, she has it. But at first I was like, she's so competent and driven at work, and so loosey-goosey at home. And so I was wondering if it was just more of a normal presentation or a rebelliousness against that kind of rigid household, and whether she was just, fighting back against that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is maybe masking at work.
That's
And
what I was just gonna say.
yeah, she's found coping mechanisms and ways, because the type of job she has is very administrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you have an executive function disorder and a very administrative job, you've got very specific ways of working. And so to the outside world, she does look very like put together and
Mm-hmm.
all of that, but you see those cracks here and there that really do point to that ADHD.
The other big thing is when you have ADHD, if you have someone or multiple people that are able to keep you focused, able to keep you on task, it makes it easier to mask. And we see she has Michelle, who is, everything has to be perfect. And I think Michelle is really good at keeping Lorelai, on task and making sure things get done. And to be honest with you, looking at the dynamic between Lorelai, Michelle, and Sookie, I don't think that they would have been successful if they were not. It wasn't that trio. I feel like if it was just Lorelai on her own or just Lorelai and Sookie, it wouldn't have worked. You had to have Michelle in there, and then you had to have Lorelai and Sookie in there for Michelle, because he would have made it like way too stuffy. Everything would have been too uptight. So the dynamic that they had in that setting, in the work environment, I think it was perfect.
I never really thought about Michelle bringing balance to them in that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting point. And just to bounce off of that quickly, I feel like I can guess your answer, but do you think Suki also has ADHD?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That one's a given too.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I have to echo what Kate said. I've never really thought about their dynamic in that way, and it definitely will allow for a lot of really good thought as I watch their scenes moving forward. So that's an excellent take there.
And if you really think about it, when I was saying about how Michelle keeps her grounded at work, she doesn't have anyone like that at home. All who's at home is Rory, and Rory basically just follows, at least in the beginning, follows Lorelai's lead for the most part. She wants to please her mom. She wants to be her friend. That so she really has no one to balance her at home. The only one that tries to keep her somewhat, in check, if that's the term I'm going to use, is Emily. But because that's her mom, and because of the difficult relationship that they've always had, Lorelai just goes back at her, and it ends up turning into an argument or a disagreement or a fight.
Exactly. She even says to her mom, when she's trying to coach Emily on how to deal with tricks,
Mm-hmm.
and she says to her, just kind of goad her on and laugh about it. Like, you have
Mm-hmm.
to do that. And so that was kind of what I was thinking with the way she runs her household, is just, is this a pushback
Mm-hmm.
because she thinks it will anger Emily, or she thinks her mom would be horrified.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think it is ultimately, at least partially, ADHD. Could be a little column A, column B
Mm-hmm.
situation, but yeah, she has this sort of coping mechanism with her
Mm-hmm.
mother, and she's so set on being independent and autonomous and making her own decisions that she can't let that outside stuff in, and so it just creates this sort of chaos at home. And Rory does sometimes have to pick up that slack. And everybody talks about how Rory is adultified and parentified, and it kind of goes to that because she is a little more emotionally stable
Mm-hmm.
than Lorelai, but it creates this sort of tendency towards anxiety and perfectionism, and some other things that you pointed out in your notes about Rory as well. So should we transition to her?
I was gonna say real quick too, with the almost like with Rory playing more of the adult type role when we start the this series. I think so many individuals had a problem with A Year in the Life because it flip-flopped so much. It almost did like a 180. Whereas when A Year in the Life came out, all of a sudden Lorelai's more mature and thinking more adult-like, and then here's Rory, who does not have her life in order. She's living out of boxes. She's going back and forth between London and the States, and you know here's Lorelai, who's sort of getting it together. They're not married at the beginning of A Year in the Life, but they're living. She's living with Luke essentially like a married couple. Um, she, is running the inn. She has her life is basically in order. And the one thing that I like too is when Rory decides to write Gilmore Girls. Lorelai has her reservations about it, and she initially says no. And that's looking at it more of from an adult, perspective. Lorelai doesn't want all of her business out there in a book for other people to read, whereas Rory's looking at it as, this is something I just have to do. It was something very spontaneous, and she just felt she needed to put everything down on paper. So it's interesting how the original series and then A Year in the Life, how, in my opinion, sort of roles flip flopped.
Mm-hmm. Rory's narcissism almost came out a little bit more
Yep.
in the newer series,
Mm-hmm.
because that's when she starts to put her own needs above her mom's, possibly for one of the first times in her life, because
Yep.
we see her catering to Lorelai so much. Lorelai needs so much support from her
Mm-hmm.
that maybe she never felt like she got to be a kid. And now the tables have turned, and Rory needs something, some purpose and fulfillment in life. And she sees this as the way, but she can't put that on the back burner and take her mom's feelings truly into account in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I have a whole lot of thoughts about the book that we'll get to someday.
The transitioning into Rory, I didn't give Rory a formal diagnosis, because there is so much to, unpack with her. However, I did point out two informal things, which is golden child syndrome and only child syndrome. Um, golden child syndrome is, more what the parent, or in Gilmore Girls, sense, the grandparents as well, the expectations that they have on that child. And from the first episode, um Lorelai had her agenda. Rory had to go to Chilton because that was the first step in going to Harvard, and she had all this pressure on her. And we do see in the very first episode that Rory does start to show signs of breaking already, because she doesn't, when she meets Dean, she all of a sudden says, I don't want to go to Chilton, I want to stay at Stars Hollow, but ultimately caves because she knows that that's what's expected of her, and that's what her mom wants her to do. And then, similar only child syndrome is more the pressures that the child puts on themselves simply because they were raised without any siblings. And with only child syndrome, it's more you have higher self expectation because you were the only, child, but also there's that social awkwardness because you really didn't have any peers when you were at home. Everything was just you. And there's also a lot of selfishness there too, which is one of the reasons why I think that Rory did have difficulties in her relationships. And going to her relationship with Dean, after they had broken up, and Rory was the other woman, and wanted to pursue a relationship with Dean even though he was with someone else. She didn't see anything wrong with that. And that sort of carries through to, in the later years, what was going on with Logan. That, even though he was engaged, and she didn't see anything wrong with that. And again, that comes down to someone that was raised that it was all about their needs, and even though we talk about, Rory being more of the adult in the earlier series and in the earlier seasons, it still so much was focused just strictly on Rory's needs. Like, there was no hesitation for Emily and Richard to give the money for Chilton because it was for Rory. Um, anything that came down to Rory, it was basically, they backed her up. They gave. Even in the episodes where Mitchum Huntsberger, he basically tells Rory she doesn't have it, as a journalist. That was something he tells Richard, he was trying to be more firm with her because that's what things are going to be like in the real world. And Richard was very upset, saying, you crushed her. And again, they're coddling her. And I think that's also one of the reasons why, when we come back to A Year in the Life, she also had difficulty with maintaining a job, because she really was coddled.
Yeah. I think both Lorelai and Rory exhibit signs of both of those things.
Mm-hmm.
From Lorelai's perspective, she's the golden child as the only child based on the social standing of her family.
Mm-hmm.
And for Rory, it's more about her exceptionality in the
Yep.
eye of her mother and the town, and her giftedness
Mm-hmm.
puts all expectations on her. So Rory has it coming from multiple angles, and that is a big part of her spiral, is the consideration of everybody else's thoughts and feelings about what she should be doing, and it contributes to that burnout and that the dropping out of Yale and all of that. But
Mm-hmm.
um, the other thing that I thought about in relation to Lorelai with golden child syndrome is, normally if there's a sibling, they're the scapegoat child.
Yep.
And in a way, given the dynamic between the grandparents and Rory, Lorelai is both the golden child and the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an interesting thing that sort of complicates their family dynamic further.
And going back to Lorelai being, the golden child as well, that's why there was so much disappointment with the pregnancy with Rory. Because again, these parents had, Richard and Emily had so many expectations for Lorelai, and basically the pregnancy was throwing a lot of that out of the window. And they've made it very clear in the series that, Emily always cared about Rory deeply. I mean, Christopher's parents talked about having an abortion, and Emily was like, absolutely not. Like, there's no way. Um, It's just the way, you know, the communication is what the problem is. And going back to one of the things that again Laura and I talked about a little bit was Laura brought up Christopher. And Christopher also, I feel, was a golden child. You know, his parents, in that one scene when they find out that Lorelai's pregnant, they're letting them know all these plans that they had for Christopher and all the expectations they had from Christopher and what he was going to do. And again, this was sort of, it was blowing up in their face. And then Christopher's father not liking that Richard was offering Christopher a job with his firm. Like, well, what does he have to work for you? And, you know, he could still go to school. And so there was a lot within that family dynamic to unpack. And one of the things, too, I had jotted down about Christopher, I wish we got a little bit deeper into his character, but based on, you know, the times that we see him, one of the things Laura had read about was Peter Pan syndrome. And that's, you know, when you stay almost childlike and you want just the freedom of being a child. And he definitely has symptoms of that. But also, one of the things that I jotted down about Christopher is the possibility of borderline personality disorder. In some of the, now again, he doesn't have, from what we see, he doesn't have all of the symptoms, but some of the symptoms that I wrote down about him, he does have the mood shifts. He does have the impulsiveness, the poor self-image, the issues with the relationships. So there's a lot within all the characters, and especially with Rory's parents, with the grandparents, that it makes it very difficult for Rory not to have her own things going on.
That's such an interesting take on Christopher that I hadn't even considered. I was like, does he also have ADHD? But the borderline could be an alternate explanation for that impulsivity and for those unstable attachments and the lack of ability to sort of do things for himself. His attachment issues, all of that could also be explained by that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
As a follow-up question, you mentioned that so much of what Rory had going on is because Lorelai had her own stuff that she was working through, that Christopher had his own problems and his own issues. Let's remove that from the equation. Let's say that Lorelai and Chris had not had any of that going on. Do you think that Rory would have been a little bit more well-rounded going into Chilton and into Yale? Do you think she still would have had those own struggles for herself? Or do you think it was stemming from what kind of rolled down to her from her parents?
I think it definitely is from what rolled down from her parents. You know, if we look at Gilmore Girls, let's say hypothetically Lorelai, let's go all the way back to Lorelai being pregnant with Rory. Let's hypothetically say that she did marry Christopher, and Christopher ended up with a stable career with Richard's firm. I think they would have had more children. I don't think Rory would have been the only child. I think there would have been, you know, more stability, obviously financial stability, which Lorelai did not have when she moved to Stars Hollow, and even throughout the entire series. You know, they were getting by, they were comfortable, but definitely no financial security there. So I think it would have been a completely different life. I think that there was more of a possibility of Rory being more like Paris, if her parents had married and stayed within that social economical circle.
So now that we didn't get that, though, do you think that her problems or her issues were more stemming from educational pressure and what Chilton was kind of forcing on her in terms of that success, or was it more just internal pressure, or maybe even just a little bit of both?
Well, let's put it this way. Chilton didn't help. So it definitely didn't help. I think Rory put a lot of pressure on herself but the pressures that came from Chilton just added to it. And I'm not even talking about the educational pressures, because we know there were educational pressures, because I mean, Chilton compared to Stars Hollow High, there was no comparison. I mean, it was just so much more advanced. But also, again, the social pressures. I mean, you had Paris and her clique. You had like Tristan, and Rory was not used to all that. She wasn't used to playing the game, in a sense. I remember when in the very first couple episodes, when Lorelai is bringing Rory to Chilton, they call Rory wanted to know why she was called Mary. I believe that was what Tristan was calling her, Mary. And Lorelai knew right away it was because of the Virgin Mary, that she's a virgin. And these are all things that Lorelai knew, because Lorelai grew up in that environment. Rory did not.
Wow, biblical insults. This is an advanced school.
Do you think that Rory would have maybe not had the breakdown at Yale that she did if Chilton had maybe prepared her a little bit better, if her parents had maybe stepped in and said, hey, you need to scale back on this self-pressure that you're kind of doing to yourself? Because it makes me think of the scene too, where even one of her advisors at Yale is just like, maybe don't take so many classes, have you considered dropping one, lighten your load? And she just can't even resonate with doing that because it's a failure for her.
Yep. No, definitely, the pressures that were put on her, which I feel she manifested a lot of those pressures on her own. I think that they are what triggered the breakdown at Yale, because just like you said, she felt that she could not, take any less classes or anything like that. However, Rory, if she had grown up in a more cutthroat environment, like Lorelai did at a young age, I feel like Rory wouldn't have cared as much. So, part of the need to please that Rory has is what contributed to the breakdown at Yale. And I find it interesting that, the people who she wanted to please the most, being, her grandparents, in a sense, that's who she went to when she left Yale, when she had the breakdown. But that to me also shows that even though she wanted to please them, she felt more comfortable around them versus Lorelai, because I think she realized that all of these things that Rory was doing, Chilton, Yale, initially it was going to be Harvard, these were, in a sense, Lorelai reliving what she couldn't do. So I think Rory was so nervous about disappointing Lorelai that that's why she ran to her grandparents.
Yeah.
Which I wanted to kind of transition us into now talking about the relationship between the grandparents, between Lorelai and Rory. There's an extensive amount of codependency there. Do you think that one of the reasons why Rory failed was because she was too codependent on what she was getting from even Emily and Richard, more so than Lorelai?
Mm-hmm.
And if she had been a little bit more independent, even from a financial standpoint or from an emotional standpoint with Lorelai, that she wouldn't have had all of those struggles.
I could see that if she wasn't as intertwined with Lorelai, with the community which she grew up in. But at the same time, with their codependence, a lot of that codependence comes from validation. Each character needs to feel validated by another character. in a sense. So Rory needs the validation from Lorelai. Lorelai's constantly seeking validation from her parents. And even going back to when you brought up Trix earlier, Emily was seeking validation from Trix. So, that's a big part of the codependence, is that seeking validation. And I think that one of the big things with the breakdown too at Yale and is because she knew that she would not get that validation from her mother. If she said, "Hey, I need to take a break," or "Hey, I need to, cut down on some of my classes." I think, Lorelai's response would have been, "This isn't you. You're able to handle this. Like you're the one that could handle this." So I do think that that validation piece of the codependence played a big role in how different things are perceived.
Yeah, and I'll still never quite get over Lorelai not validating Rory's feelings of overwhelm and disappointment, because she's basically having a mental health crisis, and Lorelai's reaction is, "I don't care. You need to persist, because
Yep.
that's the name of the game, and there's no other option but the rigor of an Ivy League education."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will give a shout out to Emily and Richard for that one, in terms of just stepping in and being like, listen, she needs to drop out for a while. She just needs to literally take a breather in so many different aspects of her life. So she's going to move here and live in the pool house and do what she needs to do to get herself back on track and feel better before she can start approaching this again. And so hats off to Emily and Richard. That was just a huge, huge plus on their side of the column for recognizing that.
And, they also didn't, push themselves onto Rory. They didn't say, "Oh, move into one of the guest rooms in the main house." They let her have her space. They let her move into the pool house, so she was able to build her own independence and start to figure things out. And I think that that time that she spent away from Yale, that she was in the pool house away from Lorelai, simply focusing on herself, but with the support of her family being right there, I think that helped her come back stronger than ever, after that break from Yale. But that also allowed Rory to self-explore, and that's where we start to see her enjoying that lifestyle that her mom ran away from. She's joined the DAR. She was hosting different charity funds and different things like that. And I think that really blew Lorelai away, because Lorelai put in so much effort to get away from all that, did not expose Rory to that until Rory was going to high school. And yet here is Rory sort of going right into the world that Lorelai did not want.
Yeah, that feels like their persistent tension, even right from Kill Me Now, when Lorelai sees Rory enjoying time with her grandfather and is like, I just assumed you'd be running with me. That assumption that they were just going to be in lockstep about everything. And now here we are 6 years later, still having the same conversation about how Rory still can't be her own person. And it's, who knows if they'll ever get over it. But going back to what you said too, eventually, Emily and Richard do pull back that acceptance, and there does come a point where they're like, "She's got to get back to Yale. We've got to do something about this," and they start to retract that support and start to put pressure on her again. And obviously, it causes her to rupture with them a little bit as well. Did you have any thoughts about this sort of them moving her into the main house, and then the priest situation, buy him a sweater, and her kind of ultimately standing up to Emily?
I think that, with Emily and Richard finally, saying like she needs to get back to Yale, I think that they realized that, Rory was not meant to be simply just a housewife. They gave her the time to work things out, to take a break, but they also wanted her to build a future for herself. That's one thing throughout the series that you see how proud, especially Richard, is of Lorelai for all she's accomplished, and running the inn to eventually owning her own, and then Lorelai graduating college, like all those moments, you could see how proud they are, and they want the same for Rory. They don't want her to just be a member of the DAR and to be a housewife living off of her husband. So that's when I think they said we need to get her back on track. And I think they made the right call with all of that. I think that they gave her the space she needed when she needed it, and they knew they needed to become more firm when it was time for her to get back into the swing of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just as a follow-up question to that before we move on to the next topic, just in general, obviously Emily could have done so much better as a parent. Lorelai could have done so much better. When you have a child that you see in your mind is working through these things like only child syndrome, golden child syndrome, what is the responsibility of the parent in terms of trying to foster an environment that allows that child to do better? And how could Emily and Richard have done better themselves?
First off, I just want to put out there for anyone that's going to be watching, there's no handbook to being a parent. There's no guidelines, anything like that. The biggest thing is to be supportive and give that child the encouragement, the space that they need. But also you do need, as a parent, to set boundaries and guidelines, and there needs to be a combination. You can't just be your child's friend, which is what Lorelai felt her and Rory had, was more of a friendship. But you can't be as overbearing as Emily and Richard were with Lorelai. You need to meet somewhere in the middle. And I think with losing Lorelai, I think Emily and Richard learned that, and I think that's why they were different with Rory than they were with Lorelai. And that's something that I think Lorelai had a very difficult time comprehending, that they were not the same people that they were when she was living with them, that they had changed. Obviously there were, everyone has their flaws, but I think that was a big thing, is that Lorelai didn't realize that they had changed. And like I said, there needs to be a balance.
Yeah, you also said something about balance when it comes to Rory in terms of finding her balance between things. And it made me think of her speech at graduation. I live in two worlds. One is a world of books. But I think that also hides I live in two worlds. One is of like middle class struggle, and the other is this high flying upper crust society. And I'm torn between the values and desires of both of those things. Did you have any thoughts maybe on kind of the internal tension there for her, where she's caught between all of these things because of these different parenting styles and all of that?
There's so much tension, inside. And again, I'm going to come back to the whole validation term, because any yearn that Rory might have that favors that more affluent world, she knows that that Lorelai is going to be annoyed about it. I got you away from there. Like this is what I didn't want for you growing up. And then she knows that, in a sense, with her grandparents, if her grandparents offer her something, whether it be, a car, because they bought Rory her first car, anything financial, she doesn't want to disappoint them, because she knows that they're doing it out of love. So there's so much internal conflict there. And also the not just with them, but the dynamic with the entire town. Stars Hollow, there really is no connection to that affluent life, and all the people that are in Emily's circle, they look down at individuals that are in Stars Hollow. So there's that conflict just within the two circles there too. One thing I find funny, and I'm going to bring it up because I feel like we could transition into this a little bit. Laura brought up the episode Emily in Wonderland and the connection that Emily and Mrs. Kim make. And I think that out of all the characters that we meet in Stars Hollow, I think Mrs. Kim is different than all of them. A lot of that has to do with culture, her culture. But also, I think that with Mrs. Kim, she had a respect for Emily because she knows that Emily wants Rory to go to the best schools, have the best education, and also is more conservative. Whereas even though Lorelai wants the same as far as education goes for Rory, Lorelai's more carefree and happy-go-lucky, and that's something that Mrs. Kim does not understand. She wants more structure. Also, Mrs. Kim deals in antiques, and Emily likes to buy very old things for the DAR and for her home, and so they have that connection there too. It's funny seeing the connection there between the two of them. I feel like she's the only character that connects with the Gilmore world. And I think it also has to do with Emily and Mrs. Kim both respect social standards, and that was something that I found interesting.
Yeah, I think one of these days we're going to have to do an Emily and Mrs. Kim exploration, because just the more I think about it over time, there's actually a lot of overlap between those two women. And echoing what you said, Lou, I think a lot of it does stem from culture, but also from religion as well.
Mm-hmm.
And even though Emily was not necessarily presenting herself as a go to church every Sunday religious figure, wasn't as hardcore maybe on the Bible as Mrs. Kim very clearly makes herself out to be. I think that was also a factor that's probably why these two women would get on very well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that waspiness, and the fact that they have their reverend as a social contact, and they just call him over for dinner to have like the talk with Rory. It's right under the surface there, that sort of Protestantism and Puritan work ethic and all of those things. I definitely want to get into that more someday, but now is not the time.
Yeah. But other than Mrs. Kim, we've talked a lot about Emily. We've talked a lot about Lorelai and Rory. We touched on Mrs. Kim now a little bit. Are there any other characters throughout the entire course of the show that you would immediately see? And again, in a fictional world, you can't give an accurate diagnosis to somebody because these are just made up characters. But anything that you clocked right off the bat for yourself in terms of this person definitely would have this or is presenting as this?
Kirk 100% is on the spectrum.
Called it.
100%. I think Liz might be on the spectrum too. Her and TJ. They just have like, for example, I'll go right back to A Year in the Life. They had the whole thing with they got sucked into the cult. They're very trusting of people. They take things at face value. So there's a lot of symptoms there that could show spectrum disorder with both of them as well. Jess 100% oppositional defiant disorder.
Also called it.
Sookie, we talked about ADHD. I brought up Christopher. And then Paris. Paris definitely has that golden child, only child syndrome. But on top of that, definitely anxiety. And she's another one that we see. Rory was a threat to her when Rory came to Chilton. Paris needed to be the one who was like number one in the class, and that Rory ended up threatening that, and that was their biggest conflict, and then they ended up becoming best friends.
And I find it interesting that Paris is the one in We've Got Magic to Do to be like, which anti-anxiety drug can I offer you right now, because you're clearly having a panic attack.
Yeah.
What about Jason? Do you think Jason has anything? Because I've speculated that he's possibly on the spectrum and or has like ADHD.
Jason is tough. Jason has the narcissistic traits as well. Jason's all about Jason. And I'm going to put it right out there. Sometimes people don't have anything diagnosed. They're just an idiot or an ass. and Jason, I took it as, Jason wanted to be a Richard in a sense. I think, he wanted to be extremely successful. I think he wanted to stay in, that circle. And I think he wanted more of an Emily in a sense. I think that's why it really didn't work out with Lorelai. I think that, part of him liked Lorelai's like the wildness and stuff like that. But as far as building his career empire, which is what he wanted to do, he knew he needed more of an Emily. And I think that it made it tough.
We've already had a whole episode on Jason, but I feel like what you just said there in the last 30 seconds could spin off another entire episode about him, because that's a lot to think about.
Yeah. Just bouncing off of what you said, where sometimes people don't have anything going on, you're just an ass. I have to ask now, Christopher's father, Strobe. Anything going on there, or just a raging a-hole?
Just a raging a-hole.
Just a narcissist, pure and simple.
And his wife, all she was doing was in that flashback just crying, and I love how Emily like tells her to get a grip. Like she all she's doing is sitting there, not like giving a thought to, what are we going to do? What does the future look like? It's just both of them. And then the fact that they wanted nothing to do with Rory, I think speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we're nearing an hour. Any final thoughts, anybody?
Yeah. I want to pose this question to Lou. Just talking again about, especially with our three main Gilmore women, we noticed that one of the thoughts that you had when preparing with us for this was that you emphasize that love is really a central theme throughout this show. And do you think that at its most basic and at its core that Gilmore Girls is a love story, not necessarily between romantic partners, but between mothers and daughters? And if your answer is yes, do you think that helps the series? Does it hurt it? And what do you see there in terms of how it can either complicate or enrich things?
I think it's definitely a love story, between mothers and daughters. And I think that it helped the series, it shows that no matter what the struggles are and no matter the conflicts and all that, at the end of the day, you still come back to one another, and you still care about one another. And I mean, there's so many different clips and fan edits that get put on, line for Gilmore Girls. I love one that I just saw last week, which were all the positive scenes between Emily and Lorelai. And like Emily's covering Lorelai with a blanket and Lorelai says, "Thank you, mommy." Like there were so many little clips like that and little Easter eggs, whatever you want to call them, in the show that show how much they cared for one another still. Like, even though they fought, there was still this foundation of, love and wanting the best for each person. And, the one thing that um, always bothered me throughout the series is I feel like Emily got such a bad rap, for the way her relationship was with Lorelai, whereas I viewed it, even from the beginning when I was younger, I viewed it as a parent that just wanted the best for her child. And yeah, the way she approached it wasn't the best, but she didn't do anything maliciously, in my opinion. Like, it all came from a good heart. And even with when she wants them to come for Friday night dinners, that was the stipulation with getting the money. She wasn't doing that like Lorelai's like, oh, here's the catch. The only reason she was doing that is because she wanted a relationship with her daughter and her granddaughter. And she felt that was the only way that she could get Lorelai to come and to bring Rory there, was by doing something like that. And I love how at the very end of A Year in Life, when she is selling the house and is moving, that she makes that stipulation sort of again that they have to come for a couple weeks in the summer and come for the week at Christmas time, because she wants to affirm that they're going to spend time with her. And I think that's sad that you basically have to make these stipulations in order to have a relationship with your child.
It's true. There's so much talk of financial abuse when it comes to Emily and Lorelai, and it's a question I've gone back and forth on myself. And we talked about this a little bit in our episode about Lorelai being hyper independent, about how they're sort of push-pull dynamic. Like, they're such different people, and they trigger each other because they're so different. But when they're able to relax into it and just sort of like, all right, I'm going to take this as it is, and I'm going to be open to it. When they're able to be more accepting of each other's ways and desires, it opens up a line of communication about that chasm between them that we see them trying to continue to work through even up to A Year in the Life. And it really, it softens the whole relationship, and it allows them to understand each other better and to work through their differences instead of butting up against each other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's also an excellent point, Lou, because it makes me think of when Christopher is going to start stepping in and financially floating Rory, and how immediately panicked Emily just seems to get in terms of, oh my gosh, they're not going to be needing that from me anymore. So I think there was definitely still that level of control that Emily, even if she was never going to admit it, was trying to exert over her daughter and granddaughter. But I think more in that moment, it just stemmed from the panic of her realizing, is our relationship about to go away because I don't have to have them over for dinner anymore if I'm not floating them?
Yep.
And there's not that commitment level anymore. And Emily's relief when I think she understands that Lorelai is still willing to be an active and present part of her life, even if those financial ties are no longer in place, is heartbreaking and beautiful all at once.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of the things too, when you were talking about Christopher with the financial, wanting to support, Rory, the one thing that just popped into my mind too is, and it's getting a little off topic, but again, it comes back down to sort of the love angle, is the fact that Christopher ended up raising Gigi, and Rory, in a sense, you could tell, especially when she confronts him with the question in A Year in Life, why didn't you fight for me, essentially. You could tell that, Rory is disappointed in the fact that, he is now raising a child when he had another child who he basically just popped, in on every once in a while. And the one thing Christopher says there is that he thinks everything was the way it was meant to be, and that there was really no, fighting Lorelai on anything. And that's something that I wish Rory would have had a better understanding of, because if you look at that from an outsider looking in, if Christopher said that he wanted, let's say, 50-50 custody, I don't think Lorelai would have ever given Rory up, to say, yeah, you could go by his house half the time. And I think Christopher backing off, it wasn't more so because he didn't care about Rory. It was that he didn't want there to be conflict and be a lot of problems, like in having to go to court, or having a legal custody agreement. He knew that it would be in her best interest to just have the dynamic the way it was.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I've said that in the past, but you just did it so succinctly. It took me 3 episodes to do it.
It's Christopher's love language in its own right.
Yeah.
Was just letting sleeping dogs lie, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think that's a good place for us to cap it off here. I'm sure that Kate and I could go on and talk about this for another 4 million hours if we wanted to. But that's not our focus here. We wanted to keep this one a little bit more succinct. So Lou, before we officially wind this down, any final thoughts?
No, I think that's, we covered a lot of it. I'm going to do my little plug. That if you are having any mental health issues, if you're struggling, there's always help out there. You could always go to your local emergency room for help, and also you could always contact SAMHSA, which is our government agency that handles all mental health disorders, and they can help get you in touch with a clinician. And you can either go to samhsa.gov, which is samhsa.gov, or you could call their number, which is 800-662-HELP. So definitely for people to know, there are people out there that you're able to talk to.
Very well said. And we will make sure that we include that information in our video description. So if anybody does need help or resources, just know that they are always there and available for you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that wraps us up. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a very fun
welcome.
conversation.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah. No, thank you for your time. It was just a wonderful exploration into some of these things that I know we'll have to give more thought to moving forward. But just thank you for joining us on this. It was really just a very enlightening conversation to have.
No, I enjoyed it.
Well, on that note, just thank you once again to everybody watching or listening to this. We hope that this has helped you in some capacity, or even just given you some more stuff to think about for Gilmore in its entirety. But on that note, we will see you next Friday for dinner.
Bye.
Bye.